Section 87 of The Toilers of the Sea, by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 7. There is an Ear in the Unknown. Several hours elapsed. The sun rose dazzling. Its first ray lighted up a motionless form upon the plateau of the Great Douvre. It was Gilliatt. He still lay outstretched on the rock. That icy and stiffened nudity no longer even shivered. His closed eyelids were pallid. It would have been difficult to say whether he was not a corpse. The sun seemed to gaze upon him. If this naked man were not dead, he was so near it that the slightest cold wind was sufficient to put an end to him. The wind began to blow warm and vivifying, the spring-like breath of May. Meanwhile the sun mounted higher in the deep blue sky. Its less horizontal rays grew crimson. Its light became heat. It enveloped Gilliatt. Gilliatt did not stir. If he breathed, it was with that feeble, dying respiration which would hardly cloud a mirror. The sun continued its ascent, its rays falling less and less oblique upon Gilliatt. The wind, which had at first been merely warm, was now hot. That rigid and naked body still remained devoid of movement, but the skin seemed less vivid. The sun, as it approached the zenith, fell perpendicularly on the plateau of the Douvre. A prodigality of light was poured from the heights of heaven. The vast reflection of the glassy sea was added to it. The rock began to grow warm, and revived the sleeper. A sigh heaved Gilliatt's breast. He lived. The sun continued its caresses, which were almost ardent. The wind, which was already the wind of the south and of summer, approached Gilliatt like a mouth breathing gently. Gilliatt stirred. The calmness of the sea was inexpressible. It murmured like a nurse beside her child. The waves seemed to be cradling the reef. The sea-birds, who knew Gilliatt, flew above him uneasily. This was no longer their former wild uneasiness. There was something indescribably tender and fraternal about it. They uttered little cries. They had the air of calling him. A sea-mew, who loved him no doubt, was so familiar as to come quite close to him. It began to speak to him. He seemed not to hear. It jumped upon his shoulder and peeked gently at his lips. Gilliatt opened his eyes. The birds, content and shy, flew away. Gilliatt sprang to his feet, stretched like a lion awakened, ran to the edge of the platform, and looked down into the passage between the Douvre beneath him. The boat was there intact. The plug had held firm. The sea had probably not disturbed it much. All was saved. Gilliatt was no longer weary. His strength was renewed. His swoon had been a sleep. He bailed out the boat, made the hold dry, and raised the leak above the waterline, dressed himself once more, drank, ate, was joyous. The leak, examined by daylight, required more labor than Gilliatt would have believed. It was a rather serious injury. The whole day was not too much for Gilliatt to repair it. On the following day, at dawn, after having removed the barriers and opened the exit from the pass once more, clothed in his rags, which had got the better of the leak, wearing Clubin's belt with the 75,000 francs, standing erect upon the mended boat beside the machinery which he had saved, Gilliatt left the Douvre reef with a good wind and a propitious sea. He steered his course for Guernsey. At the moment when he was quitting the reef, anyone who had been there might have heard him singing in a low tone the air of Bonnie Dundee. End of Chapter 7. There is an Ear in the Unknown. Section 88 of The Toilers of the Sea, by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Part Third, Déruchette, Book First, Night and Moon. Chapter 1. The Bell of the Port. The St. Sampson of today is almost a city. The St. Sampson of 40 years ago was almost a village. When the spring had come and the long winter evenings were over, people made short evenings there and went to bed at nightfall. St. Sampson was an ancient curfew parish, having preserved the habit of blowing out its candle early. People there went to bed and rose with the day. These ancient Norman villages imitate the habits of their fowls. Let us mention in addition that St. Sampson, with the exception of a few rich bourgeois families, has a population of quarrymen and carpenters. The port is a port for repairing. All day long they quarry stone or hew beams. Here the pick, there the hammer, a perpetual handling of oak and of granite. At night they are dropping with fatigue, and they sleep like lead. Heavy work brings heavy slumbers. One evening in the beginning of May, Miss Lethierry, after having for several moments gazed at the moon through the trees and listened to Déruchette's step as she walked alone in the cool of the evening in the garden of Les Bravées, retired to his chamber, opening towards the port, and went to bed. Douce and Grace were already in bed. Everyone was asleep in the house except Déruchette. Everyone in St. Sampson was also asleep. Doors and shutters were everywhere closed. There was no passing to and fro in the streets. A few lights, like the blinking of eyes about to close, gleamed redly here and there from the small windows in the roofs, a sign of the retiring of the servants. It was some time since 9 o'clock had sounded from the old Roman ivy-draped clock tower, which shares with the church of St. Brelade in Jersey the singularity of bearing as its date 4 ones, 1111, which signifies 1111. Miss Lethierry's popularity in St. Sampson was the result of his success. Success gone, a void had resulted. We are forced to believe that bad luck is contagious, and that people who are not fortunate have the plague, so speedily are they placed in quarantine. The handsome sons of good families avoided Deruchette. The isolation around Les Bravées was now such that they had not even learned in the house the little scrap of local news which had set St. Sampson in commotion that day. The rector of the parish, the Reverend Joe Ebenezer Caudray, was rich. His uncle, the magnificent dean of St. Asaph, had just died in London. The news had been brought by the mail sloop Cashmere, which had arrived from England that very morning, and the mast of which could be seen in the roadstead of St. Pierre Port. The Cashmere was to set out for Southampton the next day at noon, and it was said was to carry with it the Reverend Rector, recalled to England in haste to be present at the official opening of the will, not to mention the other pressing demands in connection with taking possession of a great inheritance. All day long St. Sampson had discussed, in a confused way, the Cashmere, the Reverend Ebenezer, his dead uncle, his wealth, his departure, his possible promotions in the future, had formed the burden of the buzzing. A single house, not being informed, had remained silent: Les Bravées. Mess Lethierry had thrown himself into his hammock all dressed. Flinging himself into his hammock had been his resource ever since the wreck of the Durande. Stretching out on his pallet is something to which every prisoner has recourse, and Mess Lethierry was the prisoner of his grief. He went to bed. It was a truce, a space for taking breath, a suspension of ideas. Did he sleep? No. Did he keep watch? No. Properly speaking, for the last 2 months and a half 2 months and a half had elapsed since the disaster. Miss Lethierry had been like a somnambulist. He had not yet recovered possession of himself. He was in that mixed and confused state which those are acquainted with who have undergone great affliction. His reflections were not thought, his sleep was not repose. During the day he was not fully awake. At night He was not asleep. He was up and had gone to bed. That was all. When he was in his hammock, oblivion came to him a little. He called this sleeping. Chimeras floated over him and within him. The nocturnal cloud, filled with confused faces, traversed his brain. The Emperor Napoleon dictated his memoirs to him. There were several Déruchettes. Queer birds were in the trees. The streets of Lons de Saulnier became serpents. Nightmare was the respite from despair. He passed his nights in dreaming and his days in reverie. He sometimes remained a whole afternoon motionless at his window, which, as the reader will remember, opened on the port. With his head bent, his elbows on the stone, his ears resting on his fists, his back turned to the whole world, his eyes fixed on the old iron ring fastened in the wall of his house, to which the Durande had formerly been moored, he was watching the rust collect on that ring. Miss Lethierry was reduced to the mechanical function of living. The most valiant of men, on being deprived of their realizable idea, come to that pass. It is a result of an existence which has been rendered void. Life is the voyage. The idea is the itinerary. Where there is no longer an itinerary, one stops short. The goal is lost. Force is dead. Fate holds an obscure discretionary power. It can touch even our moral being with its wand. Despair is almost the destitution of the soul. Very great spirits alone resist. And still Miss Lethierry meditated continually, if absorption can be called meditation, at the base of a sort of precipice of troubles. Heartbroken words escaped him, like the following: "All that remains for me is to ask from above my ticket of departure." Let us note a contradiction in this nature, as complex as the sea, of which Lethierry was, so to speak, the product. Miss Lethierry did not pray. To be powerless is in itself a kind of force. In the presence of our two great blindnesses, destiny and nature, it is in his powerlessness that man has found his chief support, prayer. Man makes his terror lend him succor. He demands aid of his fears. Anxiety counsels him to kneel. Prayer is an enormous force, peculiar to the soul, and of the same species as mystery. Prayer addresses itself to the magnanimity of the shadows. Prayer looks at the mystery with the very eyes of the shadow, and before the powerful intentness of that suppliant gaze one feels that it is possible to disarm the unknown. This possibility, once realized, is a consolation in itself. But Miss Lethierry did not pray. While he was happy, God existed for him, in flesh and blood, one might say. Lethierry spoke to him, pledged his word to him, almost shook hands with him from time to time. But in Lethierry's unhappiness God was eclipsed, a not infrequent phenomenon. This happens when one has made for himself a good God who is a good fellow. In the state of mind in which Lethierry then was, there existed for Lethierry but one clear vision, Déruchette's smile. Beyond that smile all was dark. For some time past, no doubt on account of the loss of the Durande, the counter shock of which he felt, this charming smile of Déruchette's had become more rare. She appeared thoughtful. Her bird-like and childlike pretty ways had disappeared. She was no longer seen to make a courtesy in the morning at the sound of the daybreak gun, and say to the rising sun, "Boom, day! Pray take the trouble to enter." She wore a very serious air at times, a sad thing in this sweet being. Nevertheless, she made an effort to smile at Miss Lethierry and to divert him, but her gaiety grew more tarnished from day to day, and became covered with dust, like the wing of a butterfly which has a pin through its body. Let us add that either out of grief for her uncle's grief, for there are such things as reflected sorrows, or for other reasons, she seemed now to incline greatly towards religion. In the days of the former rector, M. Jacquemin Hérode, she had only gone to church, as the reader knows, 4 times a year. She was very assiduous there now. She never missed a service, either on Sunday or on Thursday. The pious souls of the parish beheld this amendment with satisfaction, for it is great good fortune when a young girl, who runs so many risks from men, turns towards God. This at least causes the poor parents to feel more at ease on the score of love affairs. In the evening, whenever the weather permitted, she strolled for an hour or two in the garden of Les Bravées. She was almost as pensive there as Miss Lethierry, and always alone. Déruchette was the last to go to bed. This did not prevent Douce and Grace from always keeping an eye upon her, through that instinct for watching which is common to domestics. Spying relieves the tedium of serving. As for Mess Lethierry, in that abstracted state of his mind, these little alterations in Déruchette's habits escaped him. Moreover, he had not been born a duenna. He did not even notice Déruchette's punctual attendance on the parish services. Always tenacious in his prejudices against things and people pertaining to the clergy, he would have viewed this frequentation of church with no pleasure. It was not because his own moral condition was not in process of modification. Grief is a cloud and changes its form. Robust souls, as we have just said, are sometimes, by certain blows of ill fortune, almost if not wholly thrown off their bearings. Virile characters, like Lethierry, react in a given time. Despair has ascending degrees. From prostration one mounts to despondency, from despondency to affliction, from affliction to melancholy. Melancholy is a twilight. Suffering melts into it in somber joy. Melancholy is the happiness of being sad. These mournful alterations were not made for Lethierry. Neither the nature of his temperament nor the character of his unhappiness were adapted to these delicate shades. But at the moment when we find him again, the reverie of his first despair had been, for about a week, tending to dissipate. Without being less sad, Lethierry was less inert. He was still somber, but he was no longer gloomy. A certain perception of facts and events had come back to him, and he had begun to experience something of that phenomenon which may be called the re-entrance into reality. Thus, during the day, in the lower room, he did not listen to the people's words, but he heard them. Grace came in triumph one morning to tell Déruchette that Mess Lethierry had broken the wrapper of a newspaper. This half acceptance of reality is in itself a good symptom. It is convalescence. Great misfortunes stun. It is in this way that one emerges from the shock. But this amelioration first produces an aggravation of the evil. The previous state of dreaminess blunted the suffering. One saw indistinctly. One felt but little. Now the vision is clear. One escapes nothing. One bleeds at everything. Pain is accentuated by all the details which one perceives. One beholds all again in memory. To remember all is to regret all. There are all sorts of bitter aftertastes in this return to the real. One is better and at the same time worse. This was Lethierry's experience. His sufferings were more distinct. It was a shock which had restored Mess Lethierry to the sense of reality. Let us describe what this shock was. One afternoon, about the 15th or 20th of April, the 2 knocks which announced the postman had been heard at the door of the big room of Les Bravées. Douce had opened the door. It was, in fact, a letter. This letter came from the sea. It was addressed to Mess Lethierry. It was postmarked Lisboa. Douce had carried the letter to Mess Lethierry, who was shut up in his chamber. He had taken the letter, placed it mechanically on the table, and had not glanced at it. This letter remained a full week on the table with its seal unbroken. But one morning it chanced that Douce said to Miss Lethierry, "Monsieur, shall I brush the dust off your letter?" Lethierry appeared to wake up. "All right," said he, and he opened the letter. He read as follows: At sea, March 10th. Miss Lethierry of St. Sampson. You will be glad to receive tidings of me. I am aboard the Tamaulipas, bound for Never Come Back. Among the crew there is a sailor, Ayer Tostavin, of Guernsey, who will go back, and who will have some things to tell you. I take advantage of our speaking the ship Herman Cortez, bound for Lisbon, to send you this letter. Be astonished. I am an honest man, as honest as Sieur Clubin. I am bound to believe that you know what has occurred. Nevertheless, it may not be superfluous for me to inform you. Here it is. I have restored your money to you. I borrowed from you, somewhat irregularly, 50,000 francs. Before leaving St. Malo, I handed to your confidential man, Sieur Clubin, 3 banknotes of £1,000 each, making 75,000 francs. You will no doubt find this reimbursement sufficient. Sieur Clubin protected your interests and took your money with energy. He struck me as very zealous, which is my reason for notifying you. Your other confidential man, Rantaine. P.S. Sieur Clubin had a revolver, which explains why I have no receipt. Touch a torpedo, touch a charge-laden jar, and you will experience what Lethierry felt on reading this letter. Beneath that envelope, in that sheet of paper folded in 4, to which he had paid so little attention at first, there was a commotion. He recognized the writing, he recognized the signature. As for the fact, at the first moment he understood nothing about it. Such a commotion it was that it set his mind on its feet again, so to speak. This phenomenon of the 75,000 francs, confided by Rantaine to Clubin, being an enigma, was the useful feature of the shock, in that it forced Lethierry's brain to work. Conjecture is a healthy occupation for the mind. Reason is awakened. Logic is called forth. For some time past, public opinion in Guernsey had been occupied in rejudging Clubin, that honest man for so many years, so unanimously regarded with esteem. People began to question and to have their doubts. There were wagers laid for and against. Singular lights had been thrown on the subject. Clubin began to be illuminated, that is to say, he became black. A judicial investigation had taken place in St. Malo to learn what had become of the Coast Guardsman No. 619. Legal perspicacity had gone astray, which is frequently the case. It had started with the supposition that the Coast Guardsman must have been enticed away by Zuela and embarked on board the Tamaulipas for Chile. This ingenious hypothesis had gone astray in many respects. The short-sightedness of justice had not even perceived Rantaine, but during the investigation the examining magistrates had come upon other trails. This obscure affair was complicated. Clubin had entered into the enigma. A coincidence, perhaps a connection, had been established between the departure of the Tamaulipas and the loss of the Durande. Clubin had been recognized in the wine shop of the Dinan Gate, where Clubin thought he was not known. The keeper of the shop had talked. Clubin had bought a bottle of brandy. For whom? The gunsmith of the Rue Saint Vicent had talked. Clubin had bought a revolver. Against whom? The landlord of the Jean Tavern had talked. Clubin had been inexplicably absent. Captain Gertrais Gaboureau had talked. Clubin had been determined to set out, although warned, and aware that he was going to meet the fog. The crew of the Durande had talked. In fact, a full cargo was not taken, and the stowage was badly done, a piece of negligence easy to understand if a captain desires to wreck his vessel. The Guernsey passenger had talked. Clubin had fancied that he was wrecked on the Hanways. The people of Torteval had talked. Clubin had gone thither a few days before the loss of the Durande, and had strolled towards Pleinmont, close to the Hanways. He carried a valise. He went away with it, and he returned without it. The bird nesters had talked. Their story might seem to have some connection with Clubin's disappearance, provided only that smugglers were substituted for the ghosts. Lastly, the haunted house of Pleinmont itself had spoken. People determined to investigate the matter had climbed up into it and had found there what? That same valise of Clubin's. The douzaine of Torteval had seized the bag and had it opened. It contained provisions, a spyglass, a chronometer, a man's clothing and linen, marked with Clubin's initials. All this was construed in the gossip of St. Malo and of Guernsey, and ended in a decision of something like barratry. The confused features of the case were brought together. They proved a singular disregard of advice, an acceptance of the chances of the fog, a suspicious negligence in the stowage, a bottle of brandy, a drunken helmsman, a substitution of the captain himself for the helmsman, a turn of the helm which was very awkward, to say the least. The heroism of remaining on the wreck became knavery. However, Clubin had mistaken the reef. The intention of barratry admitted, the choice of the Hanways was understood. The coast easily reached by swimming, a sojourn in the haunted house while awaiting an opportunity to escape. The valise, that provision for emergencies, completed the proof. By what bond this adventure was connected with that of the coastguardsman could not be perceived. Some connection was suspected, nothing more. In connection with that man, the guard number 619, a glimpse of a whole tragic drama was to be seen. Perhaps Clubin had played no part in it, but he could be perceived in the side scenes. All was not explained by barratry. There was an unemployed revolver. This revolver probably belonged to the other affair. The scent of the people is fine and just. Public instinct excels in these restorations of the truth made of bits and morsels. Only in these facts, whence probable barratry stood forth, there existed serious uncertainties. All held good, all agreed, but the basis was lacking. No one wrecks a vessel for the pleasure of wrecking it. No one runs all those risks of the fog, the reef, swimming, concealment, and flight without some interval in the matter. What could have been Clubin's interest? His act was seen, but not his motive. Hence a doubt in many minds. Where there is no motive it seems as though there were no act. The gap was an important one. This gap had just been filled by Rantain's letter. This letter gave Clubin's motive, 75,000 francs to steal. Rantain was the deus ex machina. He had descended from the clouds with a candle in his hand. His letter furnished the final gleam of light. It explained all, and announced in addition a witness, Ayer Tostevin. A decisive point, it explained the employment for the revolver. Rantain was undoubtedly thoroughly posted in the matter. His letter permitted one to lay his finger on the whole. No extenuation was possible to Clubin's villainy. He had premeditated the shipwreck, and the proof was the valise carried to the haunted house. And even supposing him to be innocent, admitting the wreck to be accidental, ought he not at the last moment, having made up his mind to sacrifice himself on the wreck, to have handed the 75,000 francs for Mess Lethierry to the men who were escaping in the longboat? The evidence was startling. What had become of Clubin now? He had probably been the victim of his mistake. He had doubtless perished on the Douvres reef. This structure of conjectures, very nearly answering, as it will be seen, to the reality, occupied Mess Lethierry's mind for many days. Rantain's letter rendered him the service of forcing him to think. There was a first shock of surprise, Then he made the effort at reflection. He made a still more difficult effort to obtain information. He was obliged to listen to and even to seek conversation. At the end of a week he had become practical to a certain extent. His mind had regained coherence and was almost restored. He had emerged from his troubled state. Admitting that Miss Lethierry had ever been able to entertain any hope of reimbursement from Rantaine, this letter had caused his last chance to vanish. It added to the catastrophe of the Durande this new shipwreck of 75,000 francs. It put him in possession of that money just enough to make him feel its loss. This letter revealed to him the very bottom of his ruin. Hence a new suffering, and a very acute one, which we have just pointed out. He began, a thing which he had not done for 2 months, to take an interest in his household. What was to become of it? What must be reformed about it? Petty annoyances at 1,000 points, almost worse than despair. To undergo your misfortunes in detail, to dispute, foot by foot, with an accomplished foe, the ground which it has just wrested from you, is odious. Misfortune in the mass can be accepted, not its dust. The great total may overwhelm, but the detail tortures. Just now catastrophe struck you like a thunderbolt. Now it trifles with you. It is humiliation aggravating ruin. It is a second and hideous desolation added to the first, one step nearer annihilation. After the shroud, the rag. There is no sadder thought than that of diminishing. To be ruined seems simple. A violent blow, the brutality of fate, catastrophe once for all, so be it. One accepts it. All is over. One is ruined. That is well. One is dead. Not at all. One is alive. One perceives it on the very next day. To what? To pinpricks. Such and such a passer-by does not salute you. The merchants shower down their bills upon you. Yonder is one of your enemies, laughing. Perhaps he is laughing at Arnal's last pun, but all the same, that pun only seems so charming to him because you are ruined. You read your fall even in glances of indifference. The people who used to dine with you consider 3 courses too much on your table. Your defects are apparent to everyone. Cases of ingratitude no longer wait, but proclaim themselves. Every fool has foreseen what has happened to you. The malicious rend you, the worst pity you. And then 100 petty details. Nausea follows tears. You have drunk wine, you must now drink cider. 2 servant maids, that is 1 too many. This one must be discharged, and that one work harder. There are too many flowers in the garden. Potatoes must be planted. You have been in the habit of giving fruit to your friends. You will now have it sold in the market. As for the poor, they are no longer to be thought of. Are you not poor yourself? Dress, a painful question. Deprive a woman of a ribbon, what torture! Refuse ornament to her who gives you her beauty. Wear the appearance of a miser. Perhaps she will say to you, "What! You have taken the flowers from my garden, and now you are taking them from my bonnet." Alas, to condemn her to faded gowns! The family table is silent. You fancy that those around you are angry with you. Beloved faces are careworn. This is what coming down in the world means. It means a dying day by day. To fall is nothing. It is the furnace. To decrease is like a slow fire. Reign is Waterloo. Diminution is St. Helena. Fate, incarnate in the shape of Wellington, still retains some dignity, but when it becomes Hudson Lowe, what meanness! Destiny becomes a contemptible dastard. One beholds the man of Campo Formio quarreling about a pair of silk stockings, humiliating Napoleon, who humiliated England. Every ruined man traverses these two phases, Waterloo and St. Helena, reduced to a humbler proportions. On the evening to which we have referred, and which was one of the first evenings in May, Lethierry, leaving Déruchette strolling in the garden by moonlight, went to bed sadder than ever. All those petty and unpleasant details, complications of lost fortunes, all these preoccupations of the third order, which begin by being insipid and end by being gloomy, were rolling about in his mind, disagreeable cumulations of miseries. Mais Lethierry felt his fall to be irremediable. What was to be done? What was to become of him? What sacrifices must he impose on Déruchette? Which should he dismiss, douce or grasse? Should he sell Les Bravées? Should they not be reduced to quitting the island? To be nothing where one has been everything is in very truth an intolerable descent. And the idea that all was over, to recall those trips which bound France to the archipelago, those Tuesdays of sailing, those Fridays of return, that throng upon the quay, those great cargoes, that industry, that prosperity, that direct and proud navigation, that machinery into which man puts his will, that all-powerful boiler, that smoke, that reality. The steamer is the compass completed. The compass indicates the straight road, the steamer follows it. The one proposes, the other executes. Where was his Durande, his magnificent and sovereign Durande, that mistress of the sea, that queen which made him king? To have been in his country the man of ideas, the man of success, the man of revolution, to renounce it, to abdicate, to exist no longer, to become a laughing-stock, to be an empty sack which once was filled, to belong to the past when one has been the future, to end in the haughty pity of idiots, to see the triumph of routine, obstinacy, the beaten track, egotism, ignorance, to behold the going and coming of Gothic coasters, the sport of the waves, begin again, to see the antiquated grow young again, to have wasted his life, to have been a light, and to suffer eclipse. Ah, how beautiful upon the waves had been that proud smokestack, that prodigious cylinder, that pillar with a capital of smoke, that column grander than the column of Vendôme, for upon the one there is only a conquered man, while upon the other there is progress. The ocean had been subdued. It was certainty on the open sea. This had been seen in that little isle, in that little port, in little St. Sampson? Yes, it had been seen. Indeed, it had been seen, and it would never be seen again. All this throng of regrets tortured Lethierry. There are mental sobbings. Never, perhaps, had he felt his loss more bitterly. A certain stupor follows these acute attacks. Beneath this weight of sadness he fell into a doze. He remained for about 2 hours with closed eyes, sleeping a little, thinking much, feverish. These stupors hide an obscure and very fatiguing labor of the brain. Towards the middle of the night, about midnight, a little earlier or a little later, he shook off his doze. He woke, he opened his eyes, his window faced his hammock. He beheld an extraordinary thing. A form was in front of his window, an unprecedented form, the smokestack of a steamer. Miss Lethierry sat upright with a sudden movement. The hammock oscillated, as in the agitation of a tempest. Lethierry gazed. There was a vision in front of the window. The port, flooded with moonlight, was framed in its panes, and against that brightness, quite close to the house, there was outlined, upright, round and black, a superb silhouette. The smokestack of an engine was there. Lethierry sprang out of his hammock, ran to the window, raised the sash, leaned out, and recognized it. The smokestack of the Durande was before him. It was in its old place. Its four chains held it moored to the rail of a boat in which, beneath it, a mass of complicated form could be distinguished. Lethierry retreated, turned his back to the window, and fell back upon the hammock in a sitting posture. He turned round again, and again he beheld the vision. A moment later, in the time required for a flash of lightning, he was on the quay, lantern in hand. To the Durande's former mooring ring was moored a bark, bearing a little towards the stern, a massive block from which rose the smokestack straight before the window of Les Bravées. The bow of the bark ran out beyond the corner of the wall of the house, flush with the quay. There was no one on the boat. This bark had a form peculiar to itself, which all Guernsey could have described. It was the Paunch. Lethierry leapt into it. He ran to the mass, which he perceived beyond the mast. It was the engine. There it was, complete, entire, intact, squarely planted on its cast iron flooring. The boiler had all its rivets. The paddle shaft was set up on end and lashed near the boiler. The brine pump was in its place. Nothing was missing. Lethierry inspected the engine. The lantern and the moon aided each other in lighting him. He passed the whole mechanism in review. He saw the two boxes which stood beside it. He looked at the paddle shaft. He went to the cabin. It was empty. He returned to the engine and touched it. He thrust his head into the boiler. He knelt down in order to look inside. He set his lantern in the furnace, and its light illuminated the whole mechanism and almost produced the optical illusion of a lighted engine. Then he burst into a laugh, and drawing himself up, with his eyes riveted upon the engine, his arms outstretched towards the funnel, he cried, "Help!" The port bell was situated on the quay, a few paces distant. He ran to it, seized the chain, and began to jerk the bell furiously. End of Chapter 1. The Bell of the Port. Section 89 of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 2. Again the Port Bell. Gilliatt had, in fact, arrived at St. Sampson after nightfall, nearer 10 o'clock than 9, after a trip devoid of incident, but a little slow, owing to the weight of his cargo. Gilliatt had calculated the hour. The half flood had made. There was moonlight and water, so that he could enter the port. The little harbor was asleep. A few vessels were anchored there, their sails brailed upon the yards, topsails furled and without lights. At the further end several fishing boats under repair were visible on the careenage, great dismasted and stripped hulls lifting above their planking, pierced with openings here and there, the curving points of their denuded framework bearing a strange resemblance to dead beetles lying on their backs with their legs in the air. As soon as he had passed the mouth of the harbor, Gilliatt examined the port and the quay. There was no light anywhere, either at Les Bravées or elsewhere. There were no passers-by, with the exception, perhaps, of a man who had just entered or left the parsonage. And even then one could not be sure that it was a person, since the night blurs all that it draws, and the moonlight never makes anything otherwise than indistinct. Distance added to the obscurity. The parsonage of that day was situated on the other side of the port, on the place where a covered shipyard has been constructed at the present day. Gilliatt had quietly come alongside of Les Bravées and had moored the paunch to the ring of the Durande, under Mess Lethierry's window. Then he had leapt over the rail and landed. Gilliatt, leaving the paunch at the quay behind him, turned the corner of the house, passed through one little street, then another, did not even glance at the branch of the path which led to the Bû de la Rue, and in a few moments he halted in that nook of the wall where there were wild mallows with rose-colored flowers in June, holly, ivy, and nettles. It is there that, hidden under the brambles, seated on a stone, many a time on summer days, and for long hours together, and for whole months, he had gazed over the wall, which was so low as to tempt him to step across, at the garden of Les Bravées, and through the branches of the trees at two windows belonging to a certain chamber of the house. He found his stone, his nettle, the wall as low, the nook as dark as ever, and there he crouched down, crawling in like an animal, re-entering its hole rather than walking. Once seated, he made no further movement. He gazed. Again he beheld the garden, the paths, the clumps of bushes, the beds of flowers, the house, the two windows of the chamber. The moon showed him this dream. It is terrible that one should be forced to breathe. He did what he could to keep from doing so. It seemed to him that he beheld a phantom paradise. He was afraid it would all fly away. It was almost impossible that these things should really be before his eyes, and if they were there, it could only be with the imminent danger of vanishing, always pertaining to things divine. A breath, and all would be dissipated. Gilliatt trembled at this thought. Quite close to him in the garden, at the edge of a walk, was a wooden bench painted green. The reader will remember this bench. Gilliatt gazed at the two windows. He thought of the slumber of some one possible in that chamber. Behind that wall some one was sleeping. He would have liked to be elsewhere. He would have preferred to die rather than to go away. He thought of a breath heaving a breast. She, that mirage, that whiteness in a cloud, that floating obsession of his mind, she was there. He thought of the inaccessible who was asleep and so near, and within reach, as it were, of his ecstasy. He thought of the impossible woman sleeping, and visited also by visions; of the creature longed for, distant, indiscernible, with her eyes closed and her brow in her hand; of the mystery of the slumber of the ideal being; of the dreams possible to a dream. He dared not think beyond that, and yet he did. He ventured into almost disrespectful familiarity in his reverie. The quantity of feminine form which an angel can have disturbed him. The hours of night emboldened timid eyes to furtive glances. He was vexed with himself for going so far. He feared to profane by reflection upon it. In spite of himself, forced, constrained, quivering, he gazed into the invisible. He endured the thrill and almost the pain of picturing to himself a petticoat on a chair, a mantle flung on the carpet, a girdle loosened, a fichu. He imagined a corset with its lace trailing on the ground, stockings, garters. His soul was in the stars. The stars are made for the human heart of a poor man like Gilliatt, no less than for the human heart of a millionaire. Up to a certain degree of passion, every man is subject to profoundly dazzling impressions. If his be a wild and primitive nature, this is all the more true. An uncultivated mind is most susceptible of reverie. Ecstasy is a fullness which overflows like any other. The sight of those windows was almost too much for Gilliatt. All at once he beheld her, herself. From amid the branches of a thicket which had already been made dense by the spring there came forth, with an ineffable, spectral, and celestial slowness, a figure, a robe, a divine face, almost a radiance under the moon. Gilliatt felt himself grow weak. It was Déruchette. Déruchette approached. She paused. She retrieved several steps as though to return, paused again, then came back and seated herself on the wooden bench. The moon shone through the trees. A few clouds wandered among the pale stars. The sea murmured to the gloom in a low tone. The town was asleep. a mist was rising from the horizon. The melancholy was profound. Déruchette inclined her head with that pensive glance which gazes attentively at nothing. She was seated in profile. She was almost bareheaded, having a cap, but untied, which allowed a view of the commencement of hair on the back of her dainty neck. She was mechanically twisting one string of this cap round her finger. The half gloom outlined her statue-like hands. Her gown was of one of those shades which by night appear white. The trees rustled as though sensible of the enchantment which emanated from her. The tip of one of her feet was visible. In her downcast lids there was that vague contraction which indicates a repressed tear or a thought suppressed. Her arms had the ravishing indecision of not knowing where to rest themselves. Something floating was mingled with her whole attitude. It was a gleam rather than a light, the grace of a goddess. The folds of the bottom of her skirt were exquisite. Her adorable face was wrapped in virgin meditation. She was so near that it was terrible. Gilliatt could hear her breathe. In the distance a nightingale was singing. The stirring of the wind among the branches set in motion the ineffable silence of the night. Déruchette, pretty and divine, appeared in this twilight like the resultant of these rays and these perfumes. This immense and scattered charm ended mysteriously in her, and was there concentrated, and in her was its flowering. She seemed the flower soul of all that shadow. All that shadow hovering about Déruchette weighed upon Gilliatt. He was bewildered. What he felt transcends words. Emotion is always new, and words have been always in use. Hence the impossibility of expressing emotion. There is such a thing as the overwhelming of rapture. To see Déruchette, to see her herself, to see her dress, her cap, to see the ribbon which was rolling round her finger. Can such a thing be imagined? Was it possible he was near her? He heard her breathe, so she did breathe? Then the stars breathe. Gilliatt was thrilled. He was the most miserable and the most intoxicated of men. He knew not what to do. The delirium of beholding her was annihilating him. What! Was she really there? Was he really here? His ideas, dazzled and fixed, rested upon this creature as upon a precious stone. He gazed at that neck and hair. He did not even tell himself that all was now his, that in a short time, tomorrow perhaps, he should have the right to take off that cap, he should have the right to untie that ribbon. He had never for a moment conceived such an excess of audacity as to dream of that. To touch with the thought is almost the same as to touch with the hand. Love was to Gilliatt what honey is to the bear, a delicate and exquisite dream. He thought confusedly. He did not know what possessed him. The nightingale sang. He felt as if he were about to expire. To rise, to leap over the wall, to approach, to say, "It is I," to speak to Déruchette, such an idea never occurred to him. If it had occurred to him he would have fled. If anything approaching a thought did succeed in making its way through his mind, it was this: that Déruchette was there, that he needed nothing more, and that this was the beginning of eternity. A noise aroused her from her reverie, and him from his ecstasy. Some one was walking in the garden. Who it was could not be seen because of the trees. It was the footstep of a man. Déruchette raised her eyes. The steps drew near, then ceased. The person who had been walking had stopped. He must be very close at hand. The path on which the bench stood wound between two clumps of bushes. The person was there, in that passage, a few paces from the bench. Chance had so arranged the denseness of the branches that Déruchette could see, while Gilliatt could not. The moon cast a shadow on the ground from the thicket to the bench. Gilliatt saw this shadow. He looked at Déruchette. She was very pale. Her half open mouth gave vent to a cry of surprise. She had half risen from the bench and fallen back upon it. There was a mixture of fright and fascination in her attitude. Her astonishment was an enchantment full of fear. She wore upon her lips almost the radiance of a smile, and in her eyes a gleam of tears. She was as though transfigured by a presence. It did not seem as though the being whom she beheld could be of this earth. The reflection of an angel was in her gaze. The being, who was only a shadow to Gilliatt, spoke. A voice proceeded from the thicket, sweeter than the voice of a woman, but a man's voice nevertheless. Gilliatt heard these words: "Mademoiselle, I see you every Sunday and Thursday. I am told that formerly you did not come so often. It is a remark which has been made, and I beg your pardon. I have never spoken to you. It was my duty. Today I speak to you. It is my duty. I must first address myself to you. The Cashmere sails tomorrow. This is why I am come. You walk in your garden every evening. It would be an ill thing in me to know your habits if I did not cherish my present intention. Mademoiselle, you are poor. After tomorrow I shall be rich. Will you have me for your husband?" Déruchette clasped her hands like a suppliant, and gazed at the man who was speaking to her, mute, with fixed eyes, trembling from head to foot. The voice continued: "I love you. God has made the heart of man to keep silence. Since God promises eternity, it is because He wishes man not to be alone. There is for me one woman on earth. It is you. I think of you as of a prayer. My faith is in God, and my hope is in you. The wings which I have you wear. You are my life and my heaven already." "Monsieur," said Déruchette, "there is no one in the house to answer you." The voice rose again: "I have cherished this sweet dream. God does not forbid dreams. You produce upon me the effect of a glory. I love you passionately, mademoiselle. You are holy innocence. I know that this is the hour when all your household are asleep, but I had no choice of any other moment. Do you remember the passage in the Bible which was read to us? Genesis chapter 25. I have thought of it ever since. I have often read it over. The Reverend Hérode said to me, 'You need a rich wife.' I answered him, 'No, I need a poor wife.' Mademoiselle, I speak to you without approaching you. I will even retreat farther back if you desire that my shadow should not touch your feet. You are the sovereign. You shall come to me if you will. I love and I wait. You are the living form of benediction." "Monsieur," stammered Déruchette, "I did not know that I had been noticed on Sundays and Thursdays." The voice continued: "One cannot contend against angelic things. Love is all the law. Marriage is Canaan. You are the promised land of beauty. Oh, full of grace, I salute you." Déruchette replied: "I did not think that I was doing any more harm than other people who were constant in attendance." The voice pursued: "God has set His intentions in the flowers, in the dawn, in the spring. It is His will that we should love. You are beautiful in this sacred gloom of night. This garden has been cultivated by you, and in its perfumes there is something of your breath. Mademoiselle, the meetings of souls do not depend upon themselves. It is no fault of ours. You were present, nothing more. I was there, nothing more. I have done nothing but feel that I loved you. Sometimes my eyes were raised to you. I was in the wrong, but what was I to do? It was while looking at you that it all came about. One cannot help oneself. There are mysterious wills above us. The first of temples is the heart. The terrestrial paradise to which I aspire is to have your soul in my house. Do you consent to it? As long as I was poor I said nothing. I know your age. You are 21. I am 26. I go to-morrow. If you refuse me I shall not return. Be my betrothed, will you? My eyes have already put this question to you more than once in spite of me. I love you. Answer me. I will speak to your uncle as soon as he can receive me, but I turn to you first of all. It is to Rebecca that one pleads for Rebecca, unless you do not love me. Déruchette bent her head and murmured, "Oh, I adore him." This was spoken so low that only Gilliatt heard it. She remained with bowed head, as if by hiding her face in the shadow she could conceal her thoughts. A pause ensued. The leaves on the trees did not stir. It was a solemn and peaceful moment when the slumber of things is added to the slumber of beings, and when the night seems to be listening to the heart throbs of nature. In this musing time there rose like a harmony, completing silence, the immense murmur of the sea. The voice began again. "Mademoiselle," Déruchette started. The voice continued. "Alas, I am waiting." "For what are you waiting?" "Your reply." "God has heard it," said Déruchette. Then the voice became almost sonorous, and, at the same time, sweeter than ever. These words proceeded from the thicket, as from a burning bush. "Thou art my affianced bride. Rise and come. May the blue canopy wherein lie the stars be present at this acceptance of my soul by thy soul, and may our first kiss be mingled with the firmament." Déruchette rose, and remained motionless for a moment, her gaze riveted before her, no doubt, upon another's eyes. Then, with slow steps, her head erect, her arms drooping, and her fingers outspread, as when one treads upon unfamiliar ground, she went toward the thicket and disappeared. A moment later, instead of one shadow on the sandy walk, there were two. They were mingled together, and Gilliatt saw at his feet the embrace of these two shadows. Time flows from us as from an hourglass, and we have no consciousness of its flight, especially at certain supreme moments. On the one hand, this couple, who were ignorant of the presence of this witness, and who did not see him. On the other hand, this witness who did not see this couple, but who knew they were there. How many minutes did they remain thus in that mysterious suspense? It would be impossible to say. All at once a distant noise broke forth, a voice shouted, "Help!" and the port bell sounded. It is probable that this intoxicated and celestial happiness did not hear this tumult. The bell continued to ring. Anyone who sought Gilliatt in the corner of the wall would not have found him there. End of chapter 2. Again the port bell. Section 90 of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Book Second, Gratitude in Full Despotism. Chapter 1. Joy Surrounded by Anguish. Miss Lethierry rang the bell furiously. All at once he stopped. A man had just turned the corner of the quay. It was Gilliatt. Miss Lethierry ran to him, or, to speak more accurately, flung himself upon him, seized his hand between his own, and gazed into his eyes for a moment in silence, the silence of an explosion that knows not where to break forth. Then, violently shaking and pulling him and straining him in his arms, he made Gilliatt enter the lower room of Les Bravées thrust to with his back the door, which remained half open, seated himself, or rather fell upon a chair beside a large table lighted by the moon, whose reflection vaguely whitened Gilliatt's face, and, in a voice which was composed of mingled bursts of laughter and sobs, he cried: "Ah, my son, the man of the bagpipe! Gilliatt, I knew well that it was you. The paunch parbleu! Tell me about it. So you went. You would have been burned 100 years ago. It is magic. Not a screw is missing. I have always looked at everything, recognized everything, handled everything. I guess that the 2 paddle wheels are in those 2 boxes. Here you are at last. I have just been looking for you in the cabin. I rang the bell. I was in search of you. I said to myself, where is he, that I may devour him? One must admit that extraordinary things take place. This animal has returned from the Douvre reef. He brings me back my life. Thunder! You are an angel. Yes, 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 'tis my engine. No one will believe it. They will see it, and will say, it is not true. All is there indeed. Everything is there. Not a screw thread is missing. Not a bolt is lacking. The tube for the feed pipe has not budged. It is incredible that it should have suffered no injury. It only needs a little oiling. How did you manage it? And to think that the Durande will go again. The wheel shaft is dismounted as though by a jeweler. Give me your word of honor that I am not mad." He stood erect, took breath, and went on. "Swear that to me. What a revolution! I pinch myself. I believe plainly that I am not dreaming. You are my child. You are my boy. You are my good Providence. Ah, my son, to go and get my rascally engine on the open ocean, in that snare of a reef! I have seen very queer things in my life. I have never seen anything like this. I have seen Parisians who were devils. I scorn the idea that they could do that. 'Tis worse than the Bastille. I have seen the gauchos tilling the pampas. They have for a plow the branch of a tree with an elbow to it, and for harrow a faggot of thorns drawn by a leather rope, and with these they harvest grains of wheat as large as hazelnuts. 'Tis a mere trifle by the side of you. You have performed a miracle in very truth. Ah, the scamp! Come, throw yourself on my neck. We shall owe you the whole prosperity of the country. How they will growl in St. Sampson! I am going to busy myself instantly with making the boat over again. 'Tis astounding there is nothing broken about the connecting rod. Gentlemen, he has been to the Douvre. I say the Douvre. He went all alone. The Douvre, the worst pebble in existence. Do you know? Have they told you? It has been proved it was done intentionally. Clubin sank the Durande for the sake of swindling me out of some money which he was to bring me. He got Tangrouille drunk. 'Tis a long tale I will tell you about his piracy some other time. I, stupid brute that I am, had confidence in Clubin. He was caught, the rascal, for he couldn't have been able to get away. There is a God, scoundrels! You see, Gilliatt, instantly, whack, whack, we'll have our irons in the fire and rebuild the Durande. We will add 20 feet to her. They build boats longer now. I will buy timber at Danzig and Bremen. And now that I have got the machinery I can get credit. Confidence will return." As Lethierry paused, raised his eyes, with that look which sees heaven through the ceiling, and muttered between his teeth, "There is one." Then he placed the middle finger of his right hand between his eyebrows, with the nail resting on the bridge of his nose, which indicates a project passing through the brain, and went on, "Never mind. In order to begin again on a grand scale, a little ready money would have been the thing for me. Ah, If I only had my 3 banknotes, the 75,000 francs which that brigand of a Rantaine returned to me, and which that brigand of Clubin stole from me. Gilliatt silently fumbled for something in his pocket, and placed it before him. It was the leather belt which he had brought back. He opened it, and spread out on the table this belt, on the inside of which, by the light of the moon, they could decipher the word Clubin. He drew from the pocket of the belt a box, and from the box 3 bits of folded paper, which he unfolded and handed to Mess Lethierry. Mess Lethierry examined the 3 pieces of paper. It was light enough to render the figures 1000 and the word thousand perfectly visible. Mess Lethierry took the 3 notes, placed them on the table side by side, looked at them, looked at Gilliatt, remained speechless for a moment, and then came something like an eruption from an explosion. "That, too! You are a prodigy! My banknotes, all 3, 1,000 each, my 75,000 francs! Did you go to hell itself? It is Clubin's belt. Pardieu, I read his filthy name on it. Gilliatt brings back the machinery plus the money. That's something worth putting in the newspapers. I shall purchase timber of the best quality. I guess you must have found his carcass. Clubin rotted in some corner. We will get the fir at Danzig, and the oak at Bremen. We will have it well planked. We'll put the oak inside and the fir outside. In former times they did not build ships so well, and they lasted longer. It is because the wood was better seasoned, because they did not build so many. Perhaps we will make the hull of elm. Elm is good for the parts under water. It rots a thing to be sometimes dry and sometimes wet. Elm wants to be always wet. It feeds on water. What a beautiful Durande we are going to fit out! They can't dictate terms to me. I shall have no further need for credit. I have the sous. Has the like of this Gilliatt ever been seen before? I was flat on the earth, dead. He sets me on my pins again, and I was not thinking of him in the least. He had escaped my mind. It all comes back to me now. Poor fellow! Oh, by the way, you are to marry Déruchette." Gilliatt placed his back against the wall, like a man who is tottering, and said very low but very distinctly, "No." Miss Lethierry gave a start. "How's this? No?" Gilliatt replied, "I do not love her." Miss Lethierry went to the window, opened it, closed it again, returned to the table, took the 3 banknotes, folded them, placed the iron box on top of them, scratched his head, seized Clubin's belt, flung it violently against the wall, and said, "There's something the matter." He thrust his 2 fists into his pockets and repeated, "You don't love Déruchette. So it was for me that you played the bagpipes?" Gilliatt, with his back still to the wall, turned pale, like a man near his end. As he grew pale, Lethierry grew red. "Here's an imbecile! He does not love Déruchette. Well, make up your mind to love her, for she shall marry no one but you. What devil of a story are you telling me? Perhaps you think I believe it. Are you ill? Very well, send for the doctor, but don't talk nonsense. It is not possible that you should have had time to quarrel already, and to get angry with her. It is true that lovers are so stupid. Come, have you any reasons? If you have any reasons, tell them. One does not make a goose of himself without having a reason for it. But, however, I have cotton in my ears. Perhaps I heard wrong. Repeat what you said." Gilliatt replied, "I said no." "You said no. He sticks to it, the brute. There's something the matter with you, that's certain. You said no. Here's stupidity that surpasses the limits of the known world. Men get ducked for less than that. So you don't love Déruchette. Then it was for love of the old man that you have done all you have done. It was for papa's fine eyes that you went to the Douvres, that you have endured cold, that you have been hot, that you have been dying of hunger and thirst, that you have eaten the vermin of the rocks, that you have had fog, wind, and rain for a bedchamber, and that you have accomplished the task of bringing me back my engine as one brings back to a pretty woman her canary bird which has escaped. And the tempest of 3 days ago, do you suppose that I don't appreciate the matter? You have had a hard time. It was while pursing up your mouth in heart shape toward my old noodle that you hewed, cut, turned, veered, dragged, filed, sawed, built, invented, planned, and performed more miracles all alone by yourself than all the saints in paradise. Ah, idiot! Yet you have bored me enough with your bagpipe. It is called a biniou in Brittany. Always the same tune, you brute. Ah, you don't love Déruchette. I don't know what's the matter with you. I recalled it all quite well now. I was there, in the corner. Déruchette said, "I will marry him." And she shall marry you. Ah, you don't love her. On reflection, I don't understand it at all. Either you are mad or I am. And here he never says a word. It can't be permitted to a man to do all that you have done, and then to say at the end of all, "I don't love Déruchette." One does not do people a service for the sake of putting them into a rage. Well, if you don't marry her, she shall remain a spinster. In the first place, I need you myself. You shall be the pilot of the Durande. Do you imagine that I am going to let you off like this? No, 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 dear heart, I shall not let you go. I have got you. I won't even listen to you. Where is there a sailor like you? You are my man. Come, say something." In the meantime the bell had roused the household and the neighborhood. Douce and Grace had risen, and had just entered the room with an air of stupefaction, and without uttering a word. Grace had a candle in her hand. A group of neighbors, bourgeois, mariners, and peasants, who had run out in haste, stood outside on the quay, staring in amazement and petrifaction at the smokestack of the Durande in the punch. Some, on hearing Miss Lethierry's voice in the big room, began to slip in silently through the half-open door. Between the faces of two gossips was thrust the head of Sieur Landoy, who always had the good luck to be where he would have regretted being absent. Great joys ask nothing better than to have witnesses. The rather scattered support which a crowd offers pleases them. They start afresh from it. Mess Lethierry suddenly perceived that he had people around him. He welcomed the audience at once. "Ah, here you are, you fellows. 'Tis very lucky. You know the news. This man has been there, and has brought it back. Good day, Sieur Landoy. Just now, when I woke up, I espied the smokestack. It was under my window. Not a nail is missing in the thing. They make pictures of Napoleon. For my part, I prefer this to the Battle of Austerlitz. You get out of bed, good people. The Durande comes to you while you are asleep. While you are putting on your nightcaps and blowing out your candles, there are people who are heroes. Some are a pack of cowards and idlers. They coddle their rheumatism. Fortunately, that does not prevent their being madmen. These madmen go where it is necessary, and do what must be done. The man of the Butte de la Rue has just arrived from the Douvres rocks. He has fished up the Durande from the bottom of the sea. He has fished up the money from Clubin's pocket, a hole that was still deeper. But how did you do it? But you had the very devil against you, wind and sea, sea and wind. 'Tis true that you are a sorcerer. Those who say that are not so stupid after all. The Durande has come back. Tempests may rage now. This cuts them out. My friends, I announce to you that the shipwreck is no more. I have examined the machinery. It is like new, perfectly whole. The steam valves work as though on wheels. one would declare it a thing made only yesterday morning. You know that the waste water from the engine is taken outside the boat by a tube placed in another tube, through which the cold water passes as it enters the boiler in order to utilize the heat. Well, those two tubes are there, the whole engine, and the paddle wheels, too. Ah, you shall marry her." "Marry whom? The engine?" asked Sieur Landoy. "No, the girl. Yes, the engine, both. He shall be doubly my son-in-law. He shall be the captain. Good day, Captain Gilliatt. He's going to have a ship, a Durande. We're going to do business with it. There will be trade, and circulation, and commerce, and cargoes of cattle and sheep. I wouldn't give St. Sampson in exchange for London. And here's the author. I tell you that 'tis a great adventure. It will be read on Saturday in Father Mauger's Gazette. Gilliatt the crafty is a cunning fellow. What louis d'or are these?" As Lethierry had just observed, through the crack in the cover, that there was gold in the box which lay on the bank notes. He took it, opened it, emptied it into the palm of his hand, and placed the handful of guineas on the table. "For the poor, Sieur Landoy. Give these sovereigns, in my name, to the constable of St. Sampson. You know about Rantain's letter? I showed it to you. Well, I have the bank notes. Here's the wherewithal to purchase oak and fir, and to do carpentry. Look. Do you remember the weather of 3 days ago? What a massacre of wind and rain! The sky fired cannon. Gilliatt received that in the Douvre. But it did not prevent his unhooking the wreck as I unhook my watch. Thanks to him I have become someone again. Father Lethierry's galiote is going to resume its service, ladies and gentlemen. A nutshell with the 2 wheels and a pipe. I have always been crazy over that invention. I have always said to myself, I'll make one of them. It dates from a long time back. 'Tis an idea which occurred to me in Paris, in the cafe at the corner of the Rue Christine and the Rue Dauphine, while reading a journal that spoke of it. Do you know that it would not embarrass Gilliatt to put Marley's machine in his fob and walk off with it? That man is of wrought iron, of tempered steel, of diamond, a mariner in good earnest, a smith, an extraordinary fellow, more astonishing than the Prince of Hohenlohe. I call him a man of mind. None of us amount to much. Sea dogs, that's you, that's myself, that's all of us. But the lion of the sea is here. Hurrah, Gilliatt! I know not what he has done, but he certainly has been a devil of a fellow. And how can you suppose that I would not give him Déruchette?" Déruchette had been in the room for the last few moments. She had not uttered a word, she had not made a sound. She had entered like a shadow. She had seated herself, almost unnoticed, on a chair behind Miss Lethierry, as he stood there loquacious, stormy, joyous, talking loudly and with many gestures. Shortly after her another mute apparition had entered, a man dressed in black, with a white tie, with his hat in his hand, had halted in the opening of the door. There were now many candles in the group, which had swelled slowly. These lights illuminated from one side the man clad in black. His profile, of a young and charming complexion, was outlined against the dark background with the purity of a medallion. He leaned his elbow on the corner of a panel of the door, and rested his brow on his left hand, an unconsciously graceful attitude, which set off the height of the brow by the smallness of the hand. There was a hold of anguish at the corner of his contracted lips. He scrutinized and listened with profound attention. Those present, having recognized the Reverend Ebenezer Caudray, rector of the parish, had drawn aside to let him pass, but he had remained on the threshold. There was hesitation in his attitude and decision in his glance. This glance occasionally met that of Déruchette. As for Gilliatt, either by accident or intentionally, he stood in the shadow and only a very confused glimpse could be had of him. At first Miss Lethierry did not see M. Ebenezer, but he did see Déruchette. He went to her and kissed her with all the ardor which a kiss on the brow can contain. At the same time he extended his arm towards the dark corner where Gilliatt stood. "Déruchette," said he, "you are rich, and there is your husband." Déruchette raised her head in bewilderment and looked into the darkness. Miss Lethierry continued: "The wedding will take place immediately to morrow, if possible. We will have a dispensation, and, moreover, the formalities are not difficult here. The Dean does what he pleases, and one is married before one has time to cry 'Look out!' It is not as it is in France, where there are bans and publications and delays and all the fol-de-rols. And you can boast of being the wife of a brave man, and there's nothing to be said. He's as a sailor should be, and I thought of him from the very day that I saw him come back from Herm with the little cannon. Now he has come back from the Douvres with his fortune and mine, and the fortune of the country. He is a man of whom it will be said one of these days that he is impossible. You said, 'I will marry him.' You shall marry him, and you will have children, and I shall be a grandfather, and you will have the good fortune to be the lady of a fine fellow who works, who is useful, who is astonishing, who is worth 100 others, who saves the inventions of others, and who is a providence. And you, at least, will not, like nearly all the rich, proud hussies of this countryside, have married a soldier or a priest, that is to say, a man who kills or a man who lies. But what are you doing in your corner, Gilliatt? We can't see you. Douce, grâce, everybody, light, illuminate my son-in-law like the day. I betroth you, my children, and here is your husband, and here is my son-in-law. He is Gilliatt of the Bû de la Rue, the good fellow, the great sailor, and you shall have no other husband, and I will have no other son-in-law. I pledge my word again on it to God Almighty. Ah, there you are, Monsieur le Curé. You shall marry these young people for me." Miss Lethierry's eye had just fallen on the Reverend Ebenezer. Douce and Grâce had obeyed. 2 candles placed on the table lighted Gilliatt from head to foot. "How handsome he is!" cried Lethierry. Gilliatt was hideous. He was as he had been when he had emerged that same morning from the Douvres reef, in rags, with tattered elbows, a long beard, bristling hair, eyes red and bloodshot, skin peeling off his face, bleeding hands, and with bare feet. Some of the pustules made by the octopus were still visible on his hairy arms. Lethierry contemplated him. "He is my true son-in-law. How he has fought with the sea! He is all in rags. What shoulders! What paws! How handsome you are!" Grâce ran to Déruchette and supported her head. Déruchette had fainted. End of Chapter 1. Joy surrounded by anguish. Section 91 of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 2. The Leather Trunk. St. Sampson was on foot at daybreak, and St. Pierre Port began to arrive. The resurrection of the Durande created in the island a commotion comparable with that made in the south of France by La Salette. A crowd had assembled on the quay to stare at the smokestack projecting from the paunch. They would have liked to see and touch the machinery a little, but Lethierry, after having made a fresh and triumphant inspection by daylight of the engine, had stationed 2 sailors in the boat with orders to prevent all approach. Moreover, the smokestack was enough to look at. The crowd marveled. Nothing was talked about but Gilliatt. His surname of the Crafty was commented upon and accepted. Admiration was given to ending in this phrase, It is not always agreeable to have in the island people capable of doing things like that." From the outside, Miss Lethierry could be seen seated at his table in front of his window, writing, one eye on his paper, the other on the engine. He was so absorbed that he only interrupted himself once to call Douce and inquire after Déruchette. Douce replied, "Mademoiselle has risen and has gone out." Miss Lethierry had said, "She does well to take the air. She was rather ill last night because of the heat." There were a great many people in the room, and then the surprise, the joy, and the windows were shut besides. "She is going to have a fine husband." And he began to write again. He had already signed and sealed 2 letters addressed to the most notable timber merchants of Bremen. He was just completing the sealing of the third. The sound of a wheel on the quay made him raise his head. He leaned out and saw a boy pushing a wheelbarrow out of the path which led to the Bû de la Rue. This boy was going in the direction of St. Pierre Port. In the wheelbarrow there was a yellow leather trunk studded with pewter and copper nails in patterns. Miss Lethierry hailed the boy. "Where are you going, boy?" The lad halted and replied, "To the Cashmere." "What for?" "To carry this trunk." "Well, you shall carry these 3 letters also." Miss Lethierry opened the drawer of his table, took out a bit of cord, tied crosswire into one packet the 3 letters which he had just written, and tossed the package to the boy, who caught it in both hands. "You will say to the captain of the Cashmere that it was I who wrote them, and that he is to take good care of them. They are for Germany, Bremen via London." "I shall not speak with the captain, Miss Lethierry." "Why?" "The Cashmere is not lying at the quay." "Ah, she is in the roads. Quite right, because of the sea." "I can only speak to the skipper of the small boat." "You will put my letters in his care." "Yes, Miss Lethierry." "And what hour does the Cashmere sail?" "At 12 o'clock." "At noon to day. The tide rises. She has the tide against her." "But she has the wind with her." "Boy," said Miss Lethierry, pointing his forefinger at the smokestack of his engine, "do you see that? That laughs at wind and tide." The boy put the letters in his pocket, seized the handles of the wheelbarrow once more, and resumed his way towards the town. Miss Lethierry shouted, "Douce! Grace!" Grace opened the door a little way. "What's wanted, miss?" "Come in and wait." Miss Lethierry took a sheet of paper and began to write. If Grace, as she stood behind him, had been curious and had leaned over his shoulder while he was writing, this is what she might have read: "I have written to Bremen for timber. I have appointments all day with carpenters for the estimates. The rebuilding will proceed rapidly. Do you, on your side, go to the Dean and get the license. I wish the marriage to take place as soon as possible. It would be better to have it immediately. I am busy with the Durande. Do you busy yourself with Déruchette." He dated and signed it Lethierry. He did not take the trouble to seal the note, but simply folded it in 4 and handed it to Grace. "Carry this to Gilliatt." "To the Bû de la Rue?" "To the Bû de la Rue." End of Chapter 2. The Leather Trunk. Section 92 of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Book Third, Departure of the Cashmere, Chapter 1. The Havelet quite close to the church. St. Sampson cannot have a crowd without St. Pierre being deserted. A curious thing, at any given point, is a suction pump. News travels rapidly in small communities. The great matter in Guernsey, beginning with sunrise, was to go and take a look at the Durande's smokestack in front of Miss Lethierry's windows. Every other event was eclipsed in the presence of this one. Eclipse of the death of the Dean of Saint Asaph. There was no longer any question of the Reverend Ebenezer Caudray, nor of his sudden wealth, nor of his departure by the Cashmere. The engine of the Durande brought back from the Douvres, such was the order of the day. People did not believe it. The shipwreck had appeared extraordinary, but salvage seemed impossible. They vied with each other in making sure of the fact with their own eyes. Every other occupation was suspended. Long files of bourgeois in families, from the Vessin neighbored to the Mess, men, women, gentlemen, mothers with children, children with their dolls, betook themselves along all the roads towards the thing to see at Les Bravées, and turned their backs on St. Pierre Port. Many shops in St. Pierre Port were closed. In the commercial arcade there was absolute stagnation of sales and negotiations. All attention was absorbed by the Durande. Not a merchant had made his first sale, with the exception of a jeweler, who was much amazed to have sold a wedding ring "to a sort of man who seemed in great haste, and who had inquired of him where the house of Monsieur the Dean was situated." The shops which remained open were places for gossip, where the miraculous salvage was noisily discussed. Not a promenader on the Hevreuse, which is now called, no one knows why, Cambridge Park, no one in High Street, which was then called Grande Rue, nor in Smith Street, which was then called the Rue des Forges, no one in Hauteville. The Esplanade itself was deserted. One would have taken it for Sunday. A royal highness on a visit, reviewing the militia at Annise, would not have emptied the town more thoroughly. All this disorder in consequence of a mere nothing at all of that Gilliatt, who made grave men and correct persons shrug their shoulders. The church of St. Pierre Port, a triple gable in juxtaposition with transept and spire, is situated at the water's edge near the extremity of the port, almost at the very landing. It welcomes those who arrive, and bids the departing Godspeed. This church is the capital letter of the long line which the facade presents to the town. It is, at the same time, the parish church of St. Pierre Port, and deanery of the whole island. It has for its officiating priest, the surrogate of the bishop, a clergyman endowed with plenary powers. The haven of St. Pierre Port, a very fine and very large harbor at the present day, was at that epoch, and even only 10 years ago, less considerable than the port of St. Sampson. There were two huge cyclopean curving walls, starting from the shore on starboard and port, and almost uniting at their extremities, where there was a small white lighthouse. Below this lighthouse a narrow entrance, still having the double ring of the chain which closed it in the Middle Ages, gave passage to ships. Let the reader picture to himself the half-open claw of a lobster. This was the haven of St. Pierre Port. This claw took from the abyss a little sea, which it forced to remain quiet. But when there was an east wind the waves poured through the narrow channel, the harbor was covered with a choppy sea, and it was wiser not to enter. This is what the Cashmere had done that day. She had anchored in the roads. When the wind was from the east, vessels preferred to take this course, especially as it relieved them from port dues. In that case the boatmen licensed by the town, a brave tribe of mariners whom the new port has driven to beggary, came with their boats to the landing, or to stations on the beach, to get the voyagers, and transported them and their baggage, often through very tough seas, and always without accident, to the ships about to sail. The east wind is a slanting wind, very good for the trip to England. The vessel rolls, but does not pitch. When the ship to sail was in port, everyone embarked in the port. When it lay in the roads, a person had his choice of embarking from one of the points on the shore near the moorings. There were boatmen, unlicensed, in all the inlets. The Havelet was one of these inlets. This tiny harbor was quite close to the town, but so deserted that it seemed very far off. It owed its solitude to being encased in the lofty cliffs of Fort George, which commands this retired cove. The Havelet could be reached by many paths. The most direct skirted the edge of the water. It possessed the advantage of leading to town and to the church in 5 minutes, and the inconvenience of being covered by the waves twice a day. The other paths, more or less abrupt, plunged into the crevices of the cliffs. The Havelet lay in shadow even in broad daylight. Blocks out of the perpendicular were suspended everywhere. It bristled with a dense mass of nettles and undergrowth, which formed a sort of gentle night over this disorder of rocks and waves. Nothing could be more peaceful than this inlet in calm weather, nothing more tumultuous when the water was rough. There were tips of branches there perpetually damp with foam. In spring it was full of flowers, nests, perfumes, birds, butterflies, and bees. Thanks to recent improvements, these things no longer exist. They have been replaced by fine, straight lines. There are bits of masonry, quays, and little gardens. Embankments have become popular. Taste has executed justice on the singularities of the cliffs and the irregular shaped rocks. End of Chapter 1. The Havelet quite close to the church. Section 93 of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 2. Despairs in Presence of Each Other. It was a little before 10 o'clock in the morning, a quarter before, as they say in Guernsey. The flood of people seemed to be increasing at St. Sampson. The population, fevered with curiosity, streamed to the north of the island, and the Havelet, which lies on the south, was more deserted than ever. Nevertheless, a boat and boatman were to be seen there. In the boat there lay a traveling bag. The boatman seemed to be waiting. The Cashmere could be seen lying at anchor in the roads, but as it was not to start until noon, no preparations for getting under sail were visible as yet. If anyone passing along the staircase paths of the cliff had listened, he would have heard a murmur of words in the Havelet, and if he had leaned over the overhanging rocks, he would have seen, some distance from the boat, in a nook formed of rocks and branches, where the eye of the boatman could not penetrate, two persons, a man and a woman, Ebenezer and Déruchette. Those obscure niches on the sea coast which tempt maidens to the bath are not always as solitary as they are supposed to be. People are sometimes seen and listened to. Those who take refuge and shelter there can easily be followed through the dense vegetation, and, thanks to the multiplicity of paths, the granite and trees which conceal the private meeting may also conceal a witness. Déruchette and Ebenezer were standing face to face, with their eyes riveted on each other. They clasped each other's hands. Déruchette was speaking. Ebenezer was silent. A tear which had gathered and paused between his lashes hung there, but did not fall. Grief and passion were stamped on Ebenezer's religious brow. A poignant resignation was added thereto, a resignation hostile to faith, though proceeding from it. On that countenance, simply angelic up to that point, there was the beginning of a fatal expression. He who had hitherto meditated only on dogma was beginning to meditate on fate, an unhealthy meditation for a priest. Faith is decomposed in it. Nothing is more disturbing than to bend under the unknown. Man is the sufferer of events. Life is a perpetual succession. We undergo it. We never know from what quarter fate's abrupt descent will be made. Catastrophes and happiness enter, then depart like unexpected personages. They have their law, their orbit, their gravitation outside of man. Virtue does not bring happiness. Crime does not bring unhappiness. Conscience has one logic. Fate has another. No coincidence. Nothing can be foreseen. We live pell-mell and in confusion. Conscience is a straight line. Life is a whirlwind. This whirlwind unexpectedly casts upon the head of man black chaos and blue skies. Fate does not understand the art of transitions. Sometimes the wheel turns so rapidly that man hardly distinguishes the interval between one revolution and another, and the bond between yesterday and today. Ebenezer was a believer whose faith was mingled with reasoning, and a priest who was subject to passion. Religions which impose celibacy know what they are about. Nothing undoes a priest like loving a woman. All sorts of clouds threw a gloom over Ebenezer. He gazed at Déruchette too long. These two beings idolized each other. In Ebenezer's eyes lay the mute adoration of despair. Déruchette was saying, "You shall not go. I have not the strength for that. You see, I thought that I had strength enough to bid you farewell, but I have not. One cannot be forced to accomplish an impossibility. Why did you come yesterday? You should not have come if you wished to go away. I have never spoken to you. I loved you, but I did not know it. Only that first day when Monsieur Héraud read the story of Rebecca, and your eyes met mine, I felt my cheeks aflame, and I thought, oh, how crimson Rebecca must have become. If anyone had said to me yesterday, 'You love the rector,' I should have laughed. That is the terrible thing about our love. It has been like a treason. I paid no heed to it. I went to church. I saw you. I thought that everyone was like myself. I do not reproach you. You have done nothing to make me love you. You took no trouble. You looked at me. It is not your fault if you look at people, and that made me adore you. I did not suspect it. But when you took the book, it was light. When others took it, it was only a book. You sometimes cast your eyes on me. You spoke of archangels, and you were the archangel. What you said I immediately thought. Before you came, I do not know whether I believed in God. Since you came, I have become a praying woman. I said to Douce, 'Dress me very quickly that I may not miss the service,' and I ran to church. So that is being in love with a man. I did not know it. I said to myself, 'How devout I am becoming!' It is you who have taught me that I did not go to church for the sake of God. I went there for your sake. That is true. You are handsome. You talk well. When you raised your arms to heaven, it seemed to me that you held my heart in your two white hands. I was mad. I did not know it. If you wish me to tell you your fault, it is this: having entered the garden yesterday, having spoken to me. If you had said nothing to me, I should have known nothing. You would have taken your departure. I should have been sad. Perhaps now I shall die. Now that I know that I love you, it is no longer possible that you should go away. Of what are you thinking? You do not appear to be listening to me." Ebenezer replied, "You heard what was said yesterday? Alas! What can I do against that?" They were silent for a moment. Ebenezer began again. "There is but one thing for me to do to go away, and for me to die. Oh, I wish there were no sea, and that there were nothing but heaven. It seems to me that that would arrange everything. Our departure would be the same. You ought not to have spoken to me. Why did you speak to me? Then do not go away. What is to become of me? I tell you that I shall die. You will be well advanced, and I shall be in the cemetery. Oh, my heart is broken. I am very unhappy. Yet my uncle is not unkind." This was the first time in her life that Déruchette had said "my uncle" in speaking of Mess Lethierry. Up to that day she had always said "my father." Ebenezer retreated a step and made a sign to the boatman. The sound of the boat hook could be heard among the boulders, and the step of the man on the edge of his bark. "No, no!" cried Déruchette. Ebenezer drew near to her again. "It must be, Déruchette." "No, never! For the sake of an engine, is it possible? Did you see that horrible man yesterday? You cannot abandon me. You are clever. You will find a way. It cannot be that you told me to come and meet you here this morning with the idea that you would go away. I have done nothing to you. You have no reason to complain of me. Is it by this vessel that you meant to go? I will not have it. You shall not leave me. Heaven is not open to be thus closed again. I tell you that you shall stay. Besides, it is not yet time. Oh, I love you!" And pressing herself against him, she crossed the 10 fingers of both hands behind his neck, as though to make with her encircling arms a bond for Ebenezer, and with her clasped hands a prayer to God. He loosened this gentle clasp, which resisted as far as it was able. Déruchette sank back in a sitting posture on a projecting rock covered with ivy, with a mechanical gesture, turning up the sleeve of her gown to the elbow, showing her charming bare arm, with a suffused and pallid light in her eyes. The boat was approaching. Ebenezer took her head in his 2 hands. This virgin had the look of a widow, and this young man had the look of an old man. He touched her hair with a sort of religious care. He fixed his gaze upon her for some moments. Then he placed on her brow one of those kisses beneath which it seems as though a star must blossom forth, and in an accent wherein trembled supreme anguish, and in which the rending of the soul could be heard, he uttered this word, the word from the depths: "Farewell." Déruchette burst into sobs. At that moment they heard a slow, grave voice saying, "Why should you not marry?" Ebenezer turned his head. Déruchette raised her eyes. Gilliatt stood before them. He had just entered by a side path. Gilliatt was no longer the same man that he had been on the previous evening. He had combed his hair, he had shaved his beard, he had put on shoes, he wore a sailor's white shirt with a broad rolling collar, he was dressed in his newest sailor's clothes. A gold ring could be seen on his little finger. He seemed profoundly calm. There was a paleness beneath his sunburn. Suffering bronze, such was this visage. They stared at him in amazement. Although unrecognizable, Déruchette recognized him. As for the words which he had just uttered, they were so remote from what they were thinking of at the moment that they made but little impression on their minds. Gilliatt repeated, "Why should you bid each other farewell? Marry! You can go together." Déruchette started. She trembled from head to foot. Gilliatt continued, "Miss Déruchette is of age. She is dependent upon herself alone. Her uncle is only her uncle. You love each other." Déruchette interrupted him gently. "How comes it that you are here?" "Marry each other," repeated Gilliatt. Déruchette began to perceive what this man was saying to her. She stammered, "My poor uncle!" "He would refuse if the marriage had not taken place. He will consent when the marriage is already performed. Besides, you are going away. When you return he will forgive." Gilliatt added, with a shade of bitterness, "And then he is thinking only of rebuilding his boat. That will occupy him during your absence. He has the Durand to console him." "I should not like," stammered Déruchette, in a stupor in which joy was discernible, "to leave any unhappiness behind me." "It will not last long," said Gilliatt. Ebenezer and Déruchette had been dazzled, as it were. They were recovering themselves now. As their confusion decreased, the sense of Gilliatt's words became apparent to them. A cloud was mingled with them, but it was not to their interest to resist. One allows those who are saving us to have their way. Objections against a return to paradise are weak. In Déruchette's attitude, as she leaned imperceptibly on Ebenezer, There was something which made common cause with what Gilliatt said. As for the enigma of the presence of this man, and of his words, which, in Déruchette's mind in particular, evoked many varieties of astonishment, they were side issues. This man was saying to them, "Marry." This was clear. If there were any responsibility, he assumed it. Déruchette felt, in a confused way, that for many reasons he had the right so to do. What he had said of Miss Lethierry was true. Ebenezer murmured thoughtfully, "An uncle is not a father." He was under the influence of a sudden and happy change. The probable scruples of the clergyman melted and dissolved in this poor, loving heart. Gilliatt's voice became curt and harsh, and something like the pulsations of fever could be heard in it. "Instantly. The Cashmere sails in 2 hours. You have time, but you have barely time. Come." Ebenezer gazed at him attentively. All at once he exclaimed, "I recognize you. It was you who saved my life." Gilliatt replied, "I think not. Yonder, at the point of the banks." "I don't know the place." "It was on the very day of my arrival." "Let us not waste time," said Gilliatt. "And I am not mistaken, you are the man we saw last evening." "Perhaps. What is your name?" Gilliatt raised his voice. "Boatman, wait for us. We are coming back." "Miss Lethierry, you asked me how it comes that I am here. It is very simple. I walked behind you. You are 21 years of age. In this country, when people have attained their majority, and are dependent only on themselves, they can marry in a quarter of an hour. Let us take the path along the waterside. It is practicable. The sea will not cover it until noon. But come at once with me." Déruchette and Ebenezer seemed to consult each other with a glance. They stood beside each other and did not stir. They were as though intoxicated. There are such hesitations on the brink of that abyss happiness. They understood, as it were, without comprehending. "His name is Gilliatt," said Déruchette to Ebenezer. Gilliatt began again with a sort of authority. "Why do you tarry? I tell you to follow me." "Whither?" asked Ebenezer. "There," and Gilliatt pointed toward the tower of the church. They followed him. Gilliatt went on before, his step was firm. They walked unsteadily. As they advanced towards the church, something which was soon to become a smile could be seen dawning on the pure and beautiful faces of Ebenezer and Déruchette. The approach to the church illuminated them. In Gilliatt's hollow eyes reigned night. One would have said that he was a specter conducting two souls to paradise. Ebenezer and Déruchette did not fully comprehend what was about to take place. The intervention of the man was the branch at which the drowning wretch clutches. They followed Gilliatt with a docility of despair, leaning on the first comer. He who feels that he is dying is not over scrupulous in making the most of chance. Déruchette, being more ignorant, was more confident. Ebenezer pondered. Déruchette had attained her majority. The formalities of English marriage are very simple, especially in primitive countries where the rectors of the parish have almost discretionary power. But nevertheless, would the dean consent to celebrate the marriage without even inquiring whether the uncle consented? That was the question. One might make the trial, however. In any case, it was a reprieve. But who was this man? And if it really was he whom Mess Lethierry had declared to be his son-in-law on the preceding evening, how was his present course of action to be explained? He, the obstacle, had been converted into Providence. Ebenezer yielded himself to it, but he gave to what was taking place the tacit and rapid consent of the man who feels that he is saved. The path was uneven, sometimes wet and difficult. Ebenezer, in his absorption, paid no heed to the pools of water and the blocks of stone. From time to time Gilliatt turned and said to Ebenezer, "Look out for these stones. Give her your hand." End of Chapter 2. Despairs in presence of each other. Section 94 of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 3. The Foresight of Abnegation. 10:30 sounded as they entered the church. The church was empty, on account of the hour, and also on account of the solitude of the town on that day. At the further end, however, near the table which takes the place of the altar in Reformed churches, there were 3 persons. They were the dean, his assistant, and the registrar. The dean, who was the Reverend Jacquemin Hérode, was seated. The clerk and the registrar were standing. The book lay open on the table. On one side, upon a credence table, lay another book, the parish register, also open, and in it an attentive eye would have observed a freshly written page on which the ink was not yet dry. A pen and an inkstand lay beside the register. On seeing the Reverend Ebenezer Caudray enter, the Reverend Jacquemin Hérode rose. "I have been expecting you," said he. "All is ready." The dean, in fact, wore his ecclesiastical robes. Ebenezer glanced at Gilliatt. The Reverend Dean added, "I am at your service, colleague," and he bowed. This bow turned neither to right nor left. It was evident from the direction of the dean's visual ray that Ebenezer alone existed for him. The dean did not include in this salutation either Déruchette, who was beside him, nor Gilliatt, who was behind. In his glance there was a parenthesis into which Ebenezer alone was admitted. The observance of these shades form a part of good order and consolidate society. The dean resumed with graciously haughty urbanity, "I present you with my double compliments, colleague. Your uncle is dead, and you are taking to yourself a wife. You are rich through the one, and happy through the other. Moreover, now, thanks to the steamer which is to be started again, Miss Lethierry is also rich, which I approve. Miss Lethierry was born in this parish. I have verified the date of her birth in the register. Miss Lethierry has attained her majority and belongs to herself. Moreover, her uncle, who is all the family she has, gives his consent. You wish to be married at once, on account of your departure. That I understand, but as you are the rector of a parish, I should have desired a little more formality for this marriage. I will abridge it as a favor to you. The essential may be contained in the summary. The certificate is already prepared upon this register here, only the names remain to be filled in. According to the terms of the law and of customs, the marriage can take place immediately after signing. The declaration required by the license has been duly made. I take upon myself a slight irregularity, since the request for the license should have been registered a week in advance. But I yield to necessity and the urgency of your departure. So be it. I will marry you. My assistant shall be the witness for the bridegroom. As for the witness on the part of the bride." The dean turned to Gilliatt. Gilliatt nodded. "That is sufficient," said the dean. Ebenezer remained motionless. Déruchette was petrified ecstasy. The dean continued, "Now there is still an obstacle." Déruchette made a movement. The dean went on, "The representative here present of Mess Lethierry has asked for your license and has signed the declaration on the register." And with the thumb of his left hand the dean designated Gilliatt, which exempted him from articulating that sort of a name. "The envoy of Mess Lethierry told me this morning that Mess Lethierry, who was too much occupied to come in person, desired that the marriage should take place immediately. This desire, verbally expressed, is not enough. I am unable, on account of having to grant the license, and of the irregularity of which I am assuming the responsibility, to advance so rapidly without making inquiries of Miss Lethierry, or at least unless I am shown his resignation. However great may be my good will, I cannot content myself with a message which is repeated to me. I must have some writing. Let that not delay us, said Gilliatt, and he presented a paper to the Reverend Dean. The Dean seized the paper, ran his eye over it, seemed to skip several lines, doubtless not to the purpose, and read aloud, "Go to the Dean and get the license. I wish the marriage to take place as soon as possible. It would be better to have it immediately." He laid the paper on the table and went on. Signed, Lethierry. The thing would be more respectful if addressed to me, but since a colleague is in question, I will demand nothing more. Ebenezer looked at Gilliatt again. There are such things as understandings between souls. Ebenezer felt that there was deception here, and he had not the strength to denounce it, nor even an idea of doing so. Either through obedience to a latent heroism of which he caught a glimpse, or because his conscience was stunned by the thunderclap of happiness, he remained speechless. The Dean took the pen, and, aided by the registrar, he filled in the blanks of the page written in the register, then straightened himself up, and with a gesture invited Ebenezer and Déruchette to approach the table. The ceremony began. It was a strange moment. Ebenezer and Déruchette stood side by side before the minister. Anyone who has had a dream in which he was being married has experienced what they experienced. Gilliatt stood at some distance in the shadow of the pillars. Déruchette, on rising in the morning in her despair, and with a thought of the coffin and the shroud, had dressed herself in white. This attire, associated with the idea of mourning, was suitable for the wedding. A white robe immediately makes a bride. The tomb is also a betrothal. A radiance emanated from Déruchette. Never had she been what she was at that moment. Déruchette's fault lay in being, perhaps, too pretty, and not sufficiently beautiful. Her beauty sinned, if that is a sin, through excess of grace. Déruchette in repose, that is to say, outside of passion or pain, was, as we have already pointed out in detail, above all pretty. The transfiguration of the charming girl is the ideal virgin. Déruchette, rendered greater by love and suffering, had undergone that promotion, may we be allowed the expression. She had the same candor with more dignity, the same freshness with more perfume. It was something as though a daisy should be changed into a lily. The moisture of tears, scarcely dried, was on her cheeks. One, perhaps, still lingered in the corner of her smile. Tears dried, vaguely visible, are a sweet and somber embellishment for happiness. The Dean, standing beside the table, laid his finger on the open Bible and asked in a loud voice, "Is there any objection?" No one replied. "Amen," said the Dean. Ebenezer and Déruchette advanced a step towards the Reverend Jacquemin Hérode. The Dean said, "Jo Ebenezer Caudray, will you have this woman to be your wife?" Ebenezer replied, "I will." The Dean continued, "Durand Déruchette Lethierry, will you have this man to be your husband?" Déruchette, in agony of soul from too much joy, like a lamp with too much oil, murmured rather than uttered, "I will." Then, following the beautiful Anglican rite of marriage, The dean glanced about him and put this solemn question to the gloom in the church: "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" "I do," said Gilliatt. A pause ensued. Ebenezer and Déruchette felt a vague oppression through their rapture. The dean placed Déruchette's right hand in Ebenezer's right hand, and Ebenezer said to Déruchette: "Déruchette, I take thee to be my wedded wife, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness or in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part, and thereto I plight thee my troth." The dean put Ebenezer's right hand in Déruchette's right hand, and Déruchette said to Ebenezer: "Ebenezer, I take thee to be my wedded husband, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness or in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part, and thereto I plight thee my troth." The dean resumed: "Where is the ring?" This took them by surprise. Ebenezer, taken unexpectedly, had no ring. Gilliatt removed the gold ring from his little finger. It was probably the wedding ring purchased in the mooring from the jeweler in the Commercial Arcade. The dean laid the ring upon the book, then handed it back to Ebenezer. Ebenezer took Déruchette's small, trembling left hand, slipped the ring on the fourth finger, and said: "With this ring I thee wed." "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost," said the dean. "Amen," said the clerk. The dean raised his voice: "You are man and wife." "Amen," said the clerk. The dean resumed: "Let us pray." Ebenezer and Déruchette turned towards the table and knelt down. Gilliatt, who remained standing, bowed his head. They knelt before God, he bowed beneath fate. End of Chapter 3. The Foresight of Abnegation. Section 95 of The Toilers of the Sea, by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 4. For Your Wife When You Marry. On leaving the church they saw the Cashmere beginning to make ready to sail. "You are in time," said Gilliatt. They again took the path to the Havelet. They walked in front. Gilliatt now followed behind. They were two somnambulists. They had, so to speak, only changed their bewilderment. They knew neither where they were nor what they were doing. They made haste mechanically. They no longer remembered the existence of anything. They felt each other. They could not put two ideas together. In ecstasy one no more thinks than one swims in a torrent. From the midst of the darkness they had fallen into a Niagara of joy. One might say that they were undergoing the process of introduction to paradise. They did not speak to each other. They were saying too many things with their souls. Déruchette pressed Ebenezer's arm closely to her. Gilliatt's steps behind them occasionally reminded them that he was there. They were profoundly moved, but they said not a word. Excessive emotion resolves itself into stupor. Theirs was delicious, but overwhelming. They were married. They were postponing all other thoughts. They would see each other again. What Gilliatt had done was well, that was all. The depths of these two hearts thanked him ardently and vaguely. Déruchette said to herself that there was something for her to unravel in this matter later on. In the meanwhile they accepted. They felt themselves at the discretion of this decided and abrupt man who had made their happiness with authority. It was impossible to question him, to talk with him. Too many impressions rushed upon them at once. Their absorption is pardonable. Facts are sometimes like a hail. They riddle you, they stun. The abruptness of incidents falling into existences habitually calm very speedily renders existences unintelligible to those who suffer or profit from them. One is not acquainted with one's own adventure. One is crushed without guessing it. One is crowned without understanding it. Déruchette, in particular, for several hours, had been subjected to all commotions. First she had been dazzled by Ebenezer in the garden. Then came Nightmare, that monster declared her husband. Then Desolation, the angel spreading his wings and on the point of departing. Now it was Joy, an unheard of joy, with an indecipherable background, the monster giving the angel to her, Déruchette. Marriage springing from agony. That Gilliatt, the catastrophe of yesterday, the salvation of today. She could understand nothing. It was evident that since early morning Gilliatt's only occupation had been to get them married. He had done everything. He had answered for Lethierry, seen the dean, obtained the license, signed the necessary declaration. This was how it had been possible for the marriage to take place. But Déruchette did not understand it. Moreover, had she understood the how, she would not have understood the why. All there was to be done was to close her eyes, return thanks mentally, forget earth and life, allow herself to be carried to heaven by this good demon. An explanation was too long, thanks were too little. She held her peace in the sweet intoxication of happiness. A little, though, remained in them, sufficient. There are parts of the sponge which remain white under water. They possessed exactly the quantity of lucidity which was requisite for distinguishing the sea from the land and the Cashmere from any other vessel. In a few minutes they had reached the Havelet. Ebenezer was the first to enter the boat. At the moment when Déruchette was about to follow him she experienced the sensation of having her sleeve plucked gently. It was Gilliatt, who had placed his finger on a fold of her dress. "Madame," he said, "you were not expecting to depart. I thought that you would, perhaps, need dresses and linen. On board the Cashmere you will find a trunk which contains articles of clothing for a lady. This trunk came to me from my mother. It was intended for the woman whom I should marry. Permit me to offer it to you." Déruchette half awoke from her dream. She turned towards Gilliatt. Gilliatt, in a low voice, which was scarcely audible, continued: "Now, I do not wish to detain you, but you see, madame, I think that I must explain to you. On the day when that misfortune occurred you were sitting in the parlor. You said some words. You do not remember it. It is quite natural. One is not obliged to remember all the words which one utters. Mais Lethierry was greatly grieved. 'Tis certain that it was a good boat, which had rendered good service. The misfortune of the sea had happened. There was a great commotion in the countryside. These are things which one forgets, naturally. That was not the only vessel which has been lost on the rocks. One cannot think forever of an accident. Only what I wanted to say to you was this, that when they said no one will go, I went. They said it was impossible. It was not that which was impossible. I thank you for listening to me for a brief moment. You understand, madame, that if I went there it was not for the sake of offending you. Moreover, the matter is of very ancient date. I know that you are in haste. If one had the time, one would remember, but it would serve no purpose. The story goes back to one day when there was snow, and then, once when I was passing, I thought that you smiled. That is the way it is to be explained. As to last night, I had not time to go home. I had just come from my work. I was all ragged. I frightened you. You felt ill. I was wrong. That is not the way to make one's appearance before people. I pray you not to be angry with me for it. This is nearly all that I wish to say. You are about to take your departure. You will have fine weather. The wind is from the east. Farewell, madame. You think it natural, do you not, that I should say little? This is the last minute. I am thinking of that trunk, said Déruchette. But why not keep it for your wife when you marry? Madame, said Gilliatt, I shall probably never marry. That will be a pity, for you are good. Thank you. And Déruchette smiled. Gilliatt returned her smile. Then he helped Déruchette to enter the boat. Less than a quarter of an hour afterwards the boat containing Ebenezer Déruchette boarded the Cashmere in the roads. End of Chapter 4. For your wife when you marry. Section 96 of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 5. The Great Tomb. Gilliatt followed the water's edge, passed rapidly into St. Pierre Port, then set out again for St. Sampson along the seashore, shunning encounters, avoiding the roads, which were full of peasants through his achievement. As the reader knows, he had long had a way of his own of traversing the country in every direction without being seen by anyone. He knew the paths. He had made for himself isolated and winding routes. He had the wild habits of the being who feels himself disliked. He held aloof. He had taken this turn when a small child on perceiving the scant welcome in the faces of men, and it had afterwards become his instinct to remain apart. He passed the Esplanade, then the Salerie. From time to time he turned round and looked behind him at the roadstead and at the Cashmere, which had just set sail. There was but little wind. Gilliatt went faster than the Cashmere. Gilliatt walked along the rocks on the extreme edge of the water with bowed head. The flood tide was beginning to rise. At a certain moment he halted, and, turning his back to the sea, he gazed for several minutes at a clump of oak trees beyond the rocks which concealed the road of Laval. They were the oaks of the spot called the Basse Maison. There, in days gone by, Déruchette's finger had written his name, Gilliatt, on the snow. That snow had melted long ago. He pursued his path. The day was more charming than any that there had hitherto been that year. There was something nuptial about the morning. It was one of those spring days when Maine lavishes herself wholly. Creation seems to have no other object than to give itself a festival and to make its own happiness. Beneath all the sounds of the forest, as well as of the village, of the wave as well as of the atmosphere, there was a sound of cooing. The first butterflies were alighting on the first roses. All was new in nature, the grasses, the mosses, the leaves, the perfumes, the rays. It seemed as though the sun had never shone thus before. The pebbles were freshly washed. The profound song of the trees was sung by birds born yesterday. It is probable that their eggshells, broken by their tiny beaks, still lay in the nest. Newly fledged birds rustled among the trembling branches. They were singing their first song. They were winging their first flight. There was a sweet chatter of all at once: hoopoes, tomtits, woodpeckers, goldfinches, bullfinches, sparrows, and thrushes. The lilacs, lilies of the valley, daphnes, wisteria, formed an exquisite mixture in the ditches. A very pretty water lentil, which grows at Guernsey, covered the pools with a carpet of emerald. The wagtails and apple-tree strippers, who make such pretty little nests, were bathing in them. Through the gaps in the vegetation the blue sky was visible. Some Wanton clouds were pursuing each other in the azure with nymph-like undulations. One fancied that one felt the passage of kisses wafted by invisible mouths. Not an old wall but what had its bouquet of wallflowers, like a bridegroom. The plum trees were in blossom. The cytisus bushes were in blossom. White piles which shone and yellow piles which sparkled were visible through the interlacing branches. The spring cast all its silver and all its gold into the immense basket of the foliage. The new shoots were all of a fresh green. Cries of welcome were heard in the air. It was the moment of the swallow's arrival. The clusters of furze bordered the slopes of the hollow roads while waiting for the clusters of the hawthorn. The beautiful and the pretty were good neighbors. The superb was completed by the graceful. The great did not embarrass the little. Not a note of the concert was lost. Microscopic magnificences were in their own plane. In the vast universal beauty all was distinguishable, as in limpid water. Everywhere a divine fullness of a mysterious swelling allowed one to guess at the violent and unseen effort of the sap at work. That which shone, shone more. That which loved became more loving. There was something of the hymn in the flower and of radiance in the noise. The great diffuse harmony was expanding. That which is beginning to dawn invited that which is beginning to gush forth. An impulse which came from below, and which came also from on high, moved hearts vaguely, susceptible as they are to the scattered and subterranean influence of germs. The flower gave obscure promise of fruit. Every virgin meditated. The reproductions of beings, designed by the immense soul of the gloom, was roughly outlined in the irradiation of things. Betrothal was going on everywhere. There were marriages without end. Life, which is the female, united with the infinite, which is the male. The weather was beautiful, light, warm. Through the hedges in the enclosures laughing and playing children could be seen. Some of them were playing hopscotch. The apple trees, peach trees, cherry trees, and pear trees covered the orchards with their heaps of pale or crimson tufts. In the grass, cowslips, periwinkles, yarrow, daisies, hyacinths, amaryllis, violets, and veronicas. Blue borage and yellow iris warmed with those pretty little pink stars which always flourish in a troop, and which for that reason are called the companions. Creatures all gilded ran among the stones. House leeks in flower empurpled the thatched roofs. The toilers of the hives were out. The bee was at work. Space was full of the murmur of seas and the humming of flies. Nature, permeable to the springtime, was moist with voluptuousness. When Gilliatt reached St. Sampson, there was no water as yet at the head of the port, and he could traverse it dry-shod, unperceived behind the hulls of the vessels under repair. A cordon of flat stones placed at regular intervals facilitated his passage. Gilliatt was not noticed. The crowd was at the other end of the port, near the entrance of Les Bravées. There his name was in every mouth. They were talking so much about him that they paid no attention to him. Gilliatt passed by, concealed to some degree by the noise which he had created. From afar he beheld the paunch at the place where he had moored it, the smokestack of the engine between its four chains, a movement of carpenters at work, confused forms going and coming, and he heard the joyous and thundering voice of Lethierry giving his orders. He plunged into the small lanes. There was no one behind Les Bravées, all curiosity being in front. Gilliatt took the path which skirted the low wall of the garden. He halted in the corner where grew the wild mallow. Again he beheld the stone where he had sat. Again he saw the wooden bench where Déruchette had sat. He gazed at the center of the walk where he had seen the two shadows, who had disappeared, embrace. He set out again. He ascended the hill of the Chateau du Val, then redescended it, and directed his course towards the Butte de la Rue. Ume Paradis was deserted. His house was just as he had left it that morning after dressing to go to St. Pierre Port. A window was open. Through this window the bagpipe could be seen, hanging to a nail in the wall. On the table could be seen the small Bible given by way of thanks to Gilliatt by a stranger, who was Ebenezer. The key was in the door. Gilliatt stepped up, laid his hand on that key, double-locked the door, put the key in his pocket, and walked off. He went, not in the direction of the land, but of the sea. He traversed his garden diagonally by the shortest path, with no precautions for the beds, but taking care, however, not to crush the sea kale which he had planted there because it was a favorite with Déruchette. He crossed the parapet and descended among the rocks. He began to follow, still following the long and narrow line of reefs which connected the Butte de la Rue with that great obelisk of granite in the middle of the sea, which is called the Beast's Horn. It was there that the chair of Guillemot was situated. He strode from one ridge of rocks to another, like a giant on the crests of mountains. Taking such strides on a crest of reefs resembles walking on the ridge of a roof. A fisherwoman who was prowling barefoot among the pools of water some distance off, and who was just coming on shore, called to him, "Take care, the tide is rising." He continued to advance. On reaching that great rock at the point, the Horn, which formed a pinnacle in the sea, he halted. The land ended there. It was the extremity of the little promontory. He looked. In the offing a few boats were anchored and fishing. From time to time one could see silver dripping in streams in the sunlight, which indicated the drawing of the nets from the water. The Cashmere had not yet arrived opposite St. Sampson. She had spread her main topsail. She was between Herm and Jetu. Gilliatt turned the corner of the rock. He arrived under the chair of Guillemot at the foot of that sort of abrupt staircase which, less than 3 months previously, he had aided Ebenezer to descend. He ascended it. The greater part of the steps were already under water. 2 or 3 only were still dry. He climbed them. These steps led to the chair Guillemot. He reached the chair, looked at it for a moment, covered his eyes with his hand, and allowed it to glide slowly from one eyebrow to the other, a gesture by which one seems to wipe out the past. Then he seated himself in that hollow of the rock, with the cliff behind his back and the ocean under his feet. The Cashmere was at that moment coming abreast of the great round submerged tower, guarded by a sergeant and a cannon, which marks in the channel the halfway point between Herm and St. Pierre Port. Above Gilliatt's head, in the crevices, some rock flowers waved. The water was blue as far as the eye could reach. The wind being east, there was but little surf around Sark, of which only the western side is visible from Guernsey. France could be seen in the distance, like a mist, and the long yellow ribbon of the sands of Carteret. Now and then a white butterfly flitted past. Butterflies have a mania for flying over the sea. The breeze was very light. All that blue, below as well as above, was motionless. No quiver agitated those serpentine shapes, of a paler or darker azure, which mark the concealed lines of the shoals on the surface of the sea. The Cashmere, which was but little aided by the wind, had hoisted her studding sails in order to catch the breeze. She was covered with canvas, but the wind being abeam, the studding sails compelled her to hug the coast of Guernsey very closely. She had passed the St. Sampson beacon. She reached the hill of the Chateau du Val. The moment was at hand when she would double the point of the Butte de la Rue. Gilliatt watched her approach. The air and the water seemed lulled to sleep. The tide was rising, not by waves, but by swelling. The level of the water rose without palpitation. The stifled sound of the open sea resembled the breathing of an infant. In the direction of the harbor of St. Sampson, small dull blows, blows of hammers, were heard. It was probably the carpenters preparing the tackle and gear for removing the engine from the boat. These sounds hardly reached Gilliatt because of the mass of granite against which his back was placed. The Cashmere approached with the slowness of a phantom. Gilliatt waited. All at once a rippling sound and a sensation of cold made him look down. The water touched his feet. He lowered his eyes, then raised them again. The Cashmere was quite close at hand. The cliff in which the rain had hollowed out the chair Guil d'Olmur was so vertical, and the depth of water was so great there, that ships could without danger, in calm weather, sail within a few cables' lengths of the rock. The Cashmere arrived. She rose up and seemed to grow out of the water. It was like the enlargement of a shadow. The rigging stood out black against the sky in the magnificent rocking of the sea. The long veils which had been thrown across the sun for a moment became almost rosy and assumed an ineffable transparency. The waves murmured indistinctly. Not a sound troubled the magnificent slipping along of this form. One could see all on deck as though one were there oneself. The Cashmere almost grazed the rock. The helmsman was at the rudder, a cabin boy was climbing the shrouds, several passengers, leaning on the bulwarks, were contemplating the serenity of the weather. The captain was smoking, but Gilliatt saw nothing of all this. On the deck there was one corner full of sunlight. It was on this point his eyes were fixed. In that sunlight were Ebenezer and Déruchette. They were seated close to each other. They were crouching down gracefully side by side, like two birds warming themselves in a ray of midday sun, on one of those benches covered with a small tarred awning which well-ordered vessels offer to passengers, and upon which one reads, when the vessel is English, "For ladies only." Déruchette's head was on Ebenezer's shoulder. Ebenezer's arm was passed around Déruchette's waist. They were holding each other's hands, fingers interlaced in fingers. The shades between one angel and another were discernible on those two exquisite faces formed of innocence. One was the more virginal, the other more starlike. Their chaste embrace was expressive. All of marriage was there, and also all purity. That seat was already an alcove, and almost a nest. At the same time it was a halo, the sweet halo of love fleeing in a cloud. The silence was celestial. Ebenezer's eyes returned thanks, and contemplated. Déruchette's lips moved, and in that charming silence, as the wind was blowing on shore, at the rapid moment when the sloop was gliding past, a few fathoms from the chair Guil d'Olmur, Gilliatt heard Déruchette's tender and delicate voice saying, "Look, it seems as though there were a man on the rock." This apparition passed. The Cashmere left the point of the Butte de la Rue behind her and plunged into the deep ripples of the waves. In less than a quarter of an hour her masts and sails described upon the water only a sort of white obelisk growing ever smaller on the horizon. The water reached Gilliatt's knees. He watched the sloop sail away. The breeze freshened on the open sea. He could see the Cashmere hoist her lower studding sails and staysails in order to profit by this increase of wind. The Cashmere was already beyond the waters of Guernsey. Gilliatt never took his eyes from it. The water came to his waist. The tide was rising. Time was passing. The seagulls and cormorants flew uneasily around him. One would have said that they were seeking to warn him. Perhaps in those flocks of birds there was some seagull which had come from the Douvres and had recognized him. An hour elapsed. The wind from the open sea did not make itself felt in the roadstead, but the Cashmere dwindled rapidly. From all appearances the sloop was going at full speed. She was already nearly abreast of the Casquette. There was no foam around the rock of Guil d'Olmu. No wave beat the granite. The water swelled peacefully. It had almost reached Gilliatt's shoulders. Another hour elapsed. The Cashmere was now beyond the waters of Origny. The Ortac rock concealed her for a moment. She passed behind the rock, then came out again as from an eclipse. The sloop fled away to the north. She gained the open sea. She was nothing but a point now, with the scintillation of a light owing to the sun. The birds threw little cries at Gilliatt. Only his head was now visible. Gilliatt, motionless, watched the Cashmere as she vanished. The tide was nearly full. Evening was drawing on. Behind Gilliatt in the roadstead some fishing boats were returning. Gilliatt's eye, fastened to the sloop in the distance, remained fixed. That fixed eye resembled nothing that can be seen upon earth. In that calm and tragic pupil there lay the inexpressible. That gaze contained the entire quantity of appeasement which an unrealized dream leaves. It was the melancholy acceptance of another's accomplishment. The flight of a star must be followed by similar looks. From moment to moment celestial darkness increased beneath those lids whose visual ray remained fixed upon a point in space. The immense tranquillity of the shadow rose in Gilliatt's deep eyes at the same time as the infinite water around the rock of Guil d'Olmu. The Cashmere, which had become invisible, was now a speck mingled with the mist. One needed to know where it was in order to be able to distinguish it. Little by little this speck, which was no longer a form, grew pale. Then it dwindled, then it disappeared. At the moment when the vessel vanished on the horizon, the head disappeared under water. There was nothing left but the sea. End of Chapter 5. The Great Tomb, and End of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo, read by John Greenman.